Okay, a friend of mine has this Jeep here and he has been having some wobbles and shimmies that have been driving him nuts. So I thought I would use this as an opportunity to illustrate in video format my death wobble inspection checklist. The first thing that I'll do is go through and identify components in the front end and the steering system so that they make sense as we go through and inspect each one. Looking from underneath the front end, the first component that I'll point out is the steering box. It's this lighter colored box here that is bolted to the frame. You see the studs come out, or bolts come through, that bolt the steering box to the frame. If we were to look on the other side, you'd see the steering shaft that comes from the steering column inside the vehicle. It's connected with some U-joints to the balance of the steering shaft that goes to this steering box. What comes out the bottom of the steering box is what's referred to as the sector shaft. The bottom of the sector shaft is this stud that you see here. And sometimes people have problems, particularly with large tires, when they use a drop pitman arm, which I'll show next, and they end up twisting the splines on this sector shaft. There are splines or grooves in this stud as it comes out of the steering box that hold the pitman arm in place as the steering cycles. This piece right here is the pitman arm. It bolts to the sector shaft and it comes down and it attaches to the drag link. So the pitman arm right here attaches to the drag link. This end here can be a source of wobbles and problems if it wears out. I'll show how to do an inspection a little bit later. This then large piece that goes all the way to the steering knuckle is the drag link. Here's a wider view of the drag link as it goes down and connects to the steering knuckle. This is the passenger side end of the drag link where it attaches to the steering knuckle. If this end ends up getting loose or worn, it can cause wobble and shimmy problems because it would do a poor job of securing the steering system from this steering knuckle all the way back up the drag link to the pitman arm. The steering knuckle then connects to this axle C, we call it a C, at the end of the axle housing. And the steering knuckle connects to the axle C with ball joints. This is the upper ball joint right here. And then on the bottom end, this is the lower ball joint. I'll show in a little bit how to check those to see if they're worn or if there's a problem with them. As the drag link connects to the steering knuckle, it will push right or left, driver or passenger side, the knuckle as the knuckle rotates side to side on the axis of the upper and lower ball joints. As the knuckle then moves, the knuckle also has another connection right here that I'm emphasizing for the tie rod end. This is the driver side of the tie rod end. The tie rod end connects the knuckle on both sides to the whole steering system. So you can imagine if that tie rod end, the one that I'm emphasizing there, was worn or loose, that could cause some wobbles or problems. The tie rod then is this lower bar that goes all the way to the other side and connects the steering knuckles on both sides. Again, if the tie rod end on the driver's side were loose or worn, that would be potentially a source of wobbles or shimmies. This right here is an adjustment sleeve with a clamp on it that's used to lengthen, making wider the tie rod, pushing the tires out from each other to tow out the alignment, Or it can be adjusted to make the tie rod shorter and tow in the distance between the front tires. It's important to have an adjustment or a method to adjust the tie rod so that you can adjust your alignment specs to make sure that you have the appropriate amount of tow in on a Jeep. You can imagine that if a rock hits this or it becomes loose and these threads in the adjustment sleeve loosen up or get bent or stretched out, you can imagine that that would also cause wobble and shimmy problems with your front end. Likewise, this adjustment collar on the drag link, if it gets loose or worn or the threads get stretched, it's going to cause some wobble and shimmy problems as well. So there again is the pitman arm, the drag link where it attaches to the pitman arm, the drag link end, the adjustment collar that's used to center your steering wheel. It adjusts the length of the drag link, and then the drag link where it attaches to the knuckle, and the tie rod where it attaches to the knuckle, and then where it attaches to the knuckle on the other side. In order to have some resistance, in order to be able to steer, there's another component that's necessary called a track bar. If the drag link pushed or pulled against this knuckle and there were nothing to hold the axle centered underneath the frame, then turning the steering would just shift the frame side to side. So the front end component that keeps the front axle centered is the track bar. This right here is the stock location for the stock front track bar bracket. This particular track bar is a TerraFlex Munster heavy duty track bar that has an adjustment sleeve right here. And then the track bar goes up. It has a bend in order to be able to clear the front differential when the suspension cycles so that it doesn't knock on the front differential cover. And it attaches right there to the frame side track bar bracket. Now that track bar, that front track bar, is so important to hold the axle centered underneath the Jeep. If those bolts get loose, or if the bolt bracket holes oval out, or if this adjustment sleeve loosens up and the threads stretch out or get loose, or if the track bar gets weak and flexes, or if on the frame side those bolts and the bracket holes oval out or wallow out because they were loose, you can imagine that there would be a problem with what's referred to as death wobble, or even a non-death wobble shimmy. The steering system would try to turn and compensate as you're driving down the road and having road imperfections and so forth, but it's pushing against and pulling against this track bar that's necessary to keep the axle centered. If that track bar becomes loose, or the bolts become loose, or the ends or the brackets become loose, then what you can end up with is a significant oscillation, almost a harmonic resonance, as the front axle slides back and forth, with the steering system trying to compensate for it, and it gets worse and worse and worse. It can end up severely ovaling the holes for the brackets and the bolts. It can damage the bushings for the ends of the track bar. It can even rip those brackets clean off the frame at that end, or off of the axle at this end. That's what's commonly referred to as death wobble, that harmonic resonance that happens when that track bar is loose and it starts cycling back and forth, and the rest of your steering system is trying to compensate for it. That harmonic resonance almost always requires coming to close to a complete stop to stop the back and forth harmonic resonance that is death wobble. A couple other pieces, components that we'll point out. This right here is the axle shaft and the ears on the front axle shaft. The X joint in the middle is the front U-joints for the front axle shaft, and then the other U or ears right here connect into the unit bearing that we'll do a test on in a minute. If that U-joint wears out, that can cause some wobbles and shimmies because there's not a smooth operation as that axle shaft turns and subsequently then turns the tire, or vice versa. If the tire turns on a JK, it will also turn that inner shaft and outer shaft through that U-joint. If that X-shaped U-joint wears out, it's going to cause problems. This also is another nice view of the front ball joints. There's the upper ball joint. It prevents side-to-side movement, driver to passenger movement. This is the lower ball joint. The lower ball joint, it's important that it prevents significant side-to-side movement as well. Otherwise, if that knuckle, steering knuckle, if that were loose on that axle C, you can imagine that the wheel or tire could shimmy back and forth and cause wobbles and shimmy type problems that are the equivalent in difficulty to full-on death wobble that happens when the track bar is loose, or this track bar bracket becomes loose on the frame, the bolt becomes worn, the bolt hole becomes ovaled, the bushing becomes damaged, and so forth. Other components that are important to know on your front end, this right here that I'm emphasizing is the front sway bar, and this right here is the sway bar link. There's a sway bar link on each side that connects to the axle, and the front sway bar connects to the frame. This sway bar and these sway bar links help to prevent excessive sway on turns, emergency maneuvers, or just body sway as you're driving down the street and turning. The sway bar is designed to have a torsional or twisting resistance that allows the vehicle to sway a little bit side to side. If it didn't, then it would be too brittle and it could potentially break. One thing that can cause problems is if the bolt ends or the bushings for these sway bar links, where the sway bar links to the axle, become loose or worn. You can imagine if the vehicle started swaying side to side and these bolts or bushings were very loose, there would be some clanking and cycling of the suspension in a negative way. And so it's important to make sure that your sway bar links, here's the other side, are properly torqued. A few other components that are important to point out. This lower shock, sometimes referred to as the steering shock, is typically referred to as the steering stabilizer. There is movement from side to side when the steering drag link pushes on the knuckle and the tie rod pushes on both knuckles from side to side. And the steering shock or the steering stabilizer helps to tighten up the feel of the steering. It's not designed to fix the problem of having loose or worn joint ends or loose or worn bushing or bolt holes, bracket welds for the track bar. It's not designed to fix those problems. It's designed to tighten up the overall steering, this steering stabilizer. This steering stabilizer is in the stock location, so it's kind of low. It's actually lower than the actual tie rod, and so it's not uncommon for people to dent these with rocks or obstacles, and when there's a dent in that steering stabilizer, it can cause leakage, it can cause some binding when the shaft goes in and out of the steering stabilizer. It can cause problems, typically not full-on death wobble, but it can cause wobble and shimmy problems. Unfortunately, it's very common for shops or even dealers to treat wobble and shimmy problems by simply installing a heavier duty steering stabilizer right here in this location. Often it's common for the steering stabilizer to wear out prematurely if it's trying to buffer loose tie rod ends, drag link ends, loose or worn ball joints, loose or worn track bar ends, track bar bracket bolt holes, adjusting collars, even a damaged sector shaft at the end of that comes out of the steering box, or a drag link end, or there's a number of different things that can cause problems, and it's not uncommon for the steering stabilizer to wear out prematurely when it's trying to mask those problems. Unfortunately, like I had mentioned before, it's not uncommon for 4x4 shops to treat the symptoms of the problem by installing a heavier duty steering stabilizer, or even a dual steering stabilizer setup that includes a steering stabilizer on both ends in order to try to buffer the cycling or harmonic vibrations that happen, the shimmies and wobbles that happen when these other components wear out. If all these other components are properly maintained and aren't worn out, the steering stabilizer really is not necessary. It is not an integral component to the overall steering system. It's simply something that makes it a smoother, tighter operation, but it is not required. There are many people who run without a steering stabilizer in order to properly diagnose which ones of these other components are worn, broken, loose, etc. And when we do our inspection checklist, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to loosen and remove one end of the steering stabilizer so that it's no longer a mask of what other problems and sources of problems can be. The steering stabilizer is a mask of other issues, and if it's worn out prematurely, that's a sure sign that either it's been damaged during off-roading, or it's almost a sure sign that you have other problems going on, and by simply replacing the steering stabilizer, you're not fixing the problem. It's like putting a Band-Aid over a broken leg. It just won't fix the problem.